Tired of giving and never receiving? Tired of holding up the entire relationship on his own shoulders while she pouted in silence, expecting him to apologize for existing? He heard the faint rustle of her moving on the couch, probably adjusting her blanket with dramatic sighs, waiting for him to come crawling again, to ask her what was wrong, to say sorry for something she couldn't even name. But he didn't move, not toward her. Instead, he walked to the closet, slowly pulled out a duffel bag, and began folding his clothes. Not frantically, not with vengeance, just quietly, calmly, as if he were simply packing for a trip he'd long postponed. Because in truth he was. And in that moment, Luke knew. He wasn't leaving her out of anger. He was leaving to find himself again. Luke zipped the duffel halfway and stood there for a moment, watching the reflection of the city lights dance across the hardwood floor. In the background, Sophie's presence lingered like white noise. An occasional sigh, the rustling of a blanket, a faint clink of a glass. She wasn't coming to check on him. She never did. Not when he left the room, not when he grew quiet, not even when he cried. She believed silence was power, and Luke had been her prisoner for too long. He opened the dresser drawer, not with haste but with purpose. Every movement felt final. Socks, boxers, undershirts, all folded neatly, all dropped into the bag with deliberate care. Each item was a symbol of his patience, now reclaimed piece by piece. For years he'd hesitated every time they argued. He'd second-guessed his feelings, wondering if maybe he was too sensitive, too dramatic, too needy. Sophie never said those words outright, but the implication was always there. In her dismissive gestures, in her unwillingness to listen, in the way she'd turn on the TV mid-conversation or walk away mid-sentence. That night, something inside Luke finally cracked. It didn't come with yelling, or doors slamming, or shattered glass. It came quietly, the way winter settles in. Soft, almost imperceptible, until suddenly everything feels cold. Luke sat on the edge of the bed, the silence between him and Sophie as thick as concrete. She was in the living room, sulking, curled up on the couch with her arms folded like a defiant child. She hadn't said a word since their last argument, and neither had he. Tonight, for the first time, he didn't feel guilty for needing more. He wasn't packing to punish her. He wasn't trying to make a point. He was simply done. There had been so many chances for her to meet him halfway. So many nights he sat at the edge of the bed, waiting for her to reach out. So many mornings he brewed her coffee exactly the way she liked it, even after a bitter silence the night before. He had bought flowers just because, apologized for things he hadn't done, taken her side in arguments with others just to keep the peace. None of it ever seemed to matter. It was as if she viewed love as a transaction, only reciprocated when it served her mood. Luke moved into the hallway, pausing by the photo gallery on the wall. Their faces stared back at him from vacations long past. Smiles frozen in time, masking the slow unraveling that had been happening behind the scenes. A trip to Montreal where she'd spent most of the time on her phone. A weekend at the cabin when she refused to hike because he hadn't brought her favorite snacks. Memories wrapped in pretty frames, but hollow at their core. As he stared at the pictures, he realized something vital. He had been mourning the idea of Sophie for years, not the reality of who she was. The version of her he loved. The one who laughed uncontrollably at bad movies, who danced barefoot in the kitchen at midnight, who whispered dreams into his chest in the early days. She was gone. Or maybe she had never really been there. Maybe he had fallen in love with potential, and now he was done loving the promise of someone who never showed up. He stepped into the kitchen to grab his charger, and as he passed the living room, he saw her, curled on the couch, face aglow from the television. Not a glance in his direction. Not a word. No curiosity about the bags. No fear of what this silence might mean. Just indifference. The weight of that realization settled heavy in his chest. She didn't think he would leave. Not really. Sophie had always assumed he'd stay no matter what. That he'd vent, cool off, and come crawling back with open arms and a weary smile. But something had shifted. Not tonight. Not ever again. But tonight was different. He returned to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and took a deep breath. He reached into the drawer and pulled out a notepad. Just a few words. Not a dramatic letter. Not a plea for understanding. Simply, I hope one day you understand what your silence cost. Luke, He placed the note on the pillow where he had slept for years beside a woman who never really saw him. Then he zipped up the duffel fully, picked up his keys, and stood for a moment to take in the stillness of the apartment. The home they had built. The place where he had laughed, cried, and waited far too long. No part of him wanted to slam the door. He didn't need noise to validate the choice, because the loudest thing in the room was her indifference. And the quietest, most powerful thing he had ever done was finally walking away. Luke stood by the door for a moment, hand hovering over the knob, absorbing the stillness around him. The apartment was dark now, save for the flickering light of the television and the occasional hum of a passing car outside. He heard the low, rhythmic murmur of Sophie's show bleeding through the hallway. She was still on the couch, likely wrapped in the throw blanket she clung to every time she wanted to be left alone, the same blanket he used to cover her with when she fell asleep mid-sulk. But not tonight. Tonight, Luke didn't inch toward her with offerings of comfort. He didn't try to coax her out of her icy silence with soft words or forehead kisses. He didn't ask what was wrong, didn't offer to make tea, didn't search her face for answers she never gave. Instead, he slipped on his jacket, picked up his duffel and backpack, and opened the door. Quietly, almost reverently. He took one last look over his shoulder, not because he was uncertain, but because he wanted to remember the space as it was in that moment. Lifeless, stagnant, and eerily quiet. The apartment that once echoed with laughter and music had become a mausoleum for everything unspoken, a museum of emotional neglect, and he, the lone visitor. His footsteps down the hallway were soft, muffled by years of habit. Even in his departure, he moved with consideration, not wanting to startle her or turn this into a dramatic exit. There was no need. His leaving would echo louder than any slammed door or shouted accusation ever could. By the time he reached the elevator, his pulse had begun to settle. Not completely. There was still a dull throb of sadness buried deep in his chest, but the heaviness that had lingered over him for years was beginning to lift. The metal doors opened with a soft ding, and he stepped inside, grateful for the solitude. As the elevator descended, he stared at his reflection in the brushed steel. He barely recognized the man looking back. Tired eyes, jaw tight, a faint tremble in his lips. Over the years, Luke had weathered hundreds of these moments. Sophie's endless sulking, her bitter silences, the way she withdrew when things didn't go her way. Every disagreement turned into a performance, a drawn-out show of discontent, where she became unreachable, untouchable. And Luke, he was always the one to reach across the distance, always the one to apologize first, even when he hadn't done anything wrong. Always the one trying to fix something she never wanted to fix. But beneath the weariness was something new. Resolve. It had been a long time since he had chosen himself. So long, in fact, that he'd forgotten what that even felt like. Luke stepped out into the cold night air. The parking lot was nearly empty, the street lamps casting golden halos over the concrete. His car sat alone beneath one of them, like it had been waiting for this moment. He tossed his bags in the back seat, climbed in, and started the engine. The familiar rumble soothed his nerves, grounding him in reality. This was really happening. As he pulled out of the lot, he glanced up at the windows of their apartment. The living room light still glowed, a soft box of amber behind the curtains. She hadn't noticed he was gone. Or maybe she had, and she simply didn't care enough to stop him. Either way, the realization didn't bring pain. It brought clarity. It underscored the very reason he was leaving. Luke drove aimlessly at first, letting the hum of the road carry him forward. The city, bathed in the soft glow of midnight, blurred past in streaks of white and red. He didn't have a destination yet. Just a direction. Away. Away from the silences that stretched for days. Away from the emotional labor he had carried alone. Away from the woman who had become a stranger despite sharing his bed for nearly a decade. Eventually, he pulled into a motel on the edge of town. Not because it was special, because it was open and anonymous. The kind of place where no one asked questions. He paid in cash, requested a room on the far end, and carried his bags inside under the tired buzz of neon lights. The room was simple: a bed, a chair, a bathroom that smelled faintly of bleach. But for the first time in years, Luke exhaled deeply and fully. No tension coiled in his shoulders. No eggshells beneath his feet. No sulking in the next room demanding his attention, his apology, his energy. He sat on the edge of the bed and let himself feel the full weight of the moment. It wasn't relief, exactly, not yet. It wasn't victory either. What it was freedom. A terrifying, exhilarating kind of freedom. The kind that arrived without celebration, without validation. The kind you have to claim quietly, in the privacy of your own heart. He scrolled through his phone, bypassing missed messages and photos, and opened a notes app. He started writing, not to Sophie, but to himself. A kind of journal entry, a marker of where things ended and began. He used to think love meant patience, meant staying, meant holding on through the worst of it and believing that the good would return. But slowly, love had begun to feel like a leash, tightening each time he hoped for change. You didn't leave because you stopped loving her. You left because you finally started loving yourself. Don't forget that. Luke saved the note, placed the phone face down on the nightstand, and lay back on the bed. The mattress was stiff, the pillows thin, but he slept better that night than he had in months. Outside, the world kept spinning. Sophie, somewhere in that dim apartment, still hadn't called. Maybe she wouldn't. Maybe she'd wake in the morning and finally realize the weight of what had happened. Or maybe she'd sit in the same spot, arms folded, still waiting for an apology that would never come. Either way, Luke wouldn't be there. The escape wasn't loud. It wasn't cinematic. It didn't need to be. It was honest. And it was enough. The morning after Luke left began the same way as countless others had. Sophie woke late, stirred by the soft flicker of sunlight stretching across the living room wall. She was curled up on the couch, limbs stiff from a night of shallow, restless sleep. Her blanket had half fallen to the floor, and the TV played quietly in the background, looping through an early morning infomercial she hadn't meant to watch. The remote had slipped between the cushions. She yawned, sat up slowly, rubbed the corner of her eyes, and glanced at the clock. Almost 10. Luke usually made coffee by now. It took a full minute before the thought registered as odd. Their last argument was over something small. Dinner plans, maybe, or laundry, or the way he said something too directly. It didn't matter anymore. The specifics blurred together in a haze of sighs and eye rolls and her perpetual dissatisfaction. She wanted everything her way, always, and when life didn't align with her desires, she punished the person closest to her. The apartment was silent, truly silent. Not the comforting kind of quiet, but the kind that seeps into your skin and unsettles you. The kind that makes the hair on your arms stand on end. She waited for the clink of a mug, the familiar scent of dark roast, the distant hum of a kettle, or the sound of movement from the bedroom. Nothing. Her brows furrowed. Maybe he had gone out early. Groceries, a walk, clearing his head. He did that sometimes when things between them grew tense. But he always left a text, a note, some indication he hadn't vanished. She stood, barefoot, padding softly into the hallway. The bedroom door was open. The bed was made, too perfectly. The closet was partially empty. She paused, blinked once, and then again, as if her eyes were playing tricks on her. Luke's bags were gone. She moved toward the dresser, pulled open a drawer. Half empty. She checked another. More missing clothes. His laptop was gone from the desk. The phone charger he always left beside the lamp had disappeared too. Her breath caught, just slightly. Her gaze fell on the pillow. A single piece of notepad paper rested there, neatly torn from the pad he kept in his nightstand. She hesitated before picking it up, her fingers trembling before they even touched it. "I hope one day you understand what your silence cost. Luke." The words hit her like a splash of ice water. She sat on the edge of the bed and read the note again, as if she could find a different meaning the second time. But the words were plain. Final. Luke had loved her once. Deeply. He remembered their early days. Long walks in the city, shared books and wine. Her laugh when it was genuine and unguarded. But that woman had become a ghost. And in her place was someone cold, unreachable, emotionally starving, and starving him in return. He was gone. Not just for a drive, not just for the day. He had left her. She stared at the paper for several minutes, then slowly lowered it into her lap. The apartment around her looked exactly the same, but nothing about it felt the same. Every object suddenly became unfamiliar. The couch where he used to sit reading. The table where they shared quiet dinners. The window he always opened just a crack before sleeping. All became reminders of the absence. not of the man. She picked up her phone and dialed his number without thinking, straight to voicemail. Again, voicemail. She tried texting. Are you okay? Where did you go? Let's talk. But she knew, even as she hit send, that there would be no response. Luke wasn't ignoring her. He was done. The words settled heavily in her chest. It wasn't like the usual tension that followed one of their arguments, those cycles of distance, sulking, and quiet reconciliation. This was something else. This was a door that had closed with such finality that no key remained. She wandered the apartment, phone in hand, trying to retrace something, anything that could explain this. Hadn't she just told herself he was overreacting again? That he'd come around like he always did? But now the apartment felt haunted by everything she hadn't said, everything she hadn't done. She sat at the kitchen counter and tried to cry, but no tears came. Just a tight ache in her throat and a dull echo in her mind of all the things she'd assumed she'd never have to confront. He stood slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the city lights blinked through the drizzle, casting long, soft reflections on the apartment walls. He looked at the life they had built. The framed pictures, the furniture he'd assembled, the small tokens of togetherness, and felt nothing but fatigue. She had always believed Luke would stay. That no matter how long her silences lasted, no matter how many cold shoulders she turned his way, he'd wait. She thought his love was endless. But it turned out his patience had a quiet, unannounced expiration date. Her eyes darted around the space, seeing it now through a different lens. The missed chances, the apathy, the comfort she'd taken for granted. He had loved her deeply, and she had measured that love against how easy it was to stay still, how long she could avoid growing. And now he was gone. Across the city, Luke was waking in a modest motel room, stretching with the unfamiliar weightlessness of a man who had just reclaimed his own name. He didn't check his phone. He didn't expect anything Sophie could say would change his path. Her silence had already spoken volumes for years. Back in the apartment, Sophie sat with the note in her hands, and the terrible realization slowly setting in that for the first time in their relationship, Luke had said everything without saying much at all. And it was deafening. The motel stay lasted only 3 nights. It wasn't a place to build anything, only a quiet transition between the life Luke was leaving and the one he was beginning. On the 4th morning, with the sunrise bleeding pale gold through the window blinds, Luke packed up what little he had taken with him and checked out without fanfare. There was no dramatic transformation, no epiphany, just peace, a quiet steadiness he hadn't felt in years. He drove with the windows down, letting the wind replace the stagnant air that had settled in his lungs after years of emotional compromise. The road was open, winding through unfamiliar neighborhoods and sun-drenched streets. For the first time, he didn't need a destination to feel like he was going somewhere. The act of moving forward was enough. Luke found a short-term rental 2 towns over, a modest 1-bedroom loft above a small bookstore. The ceilings were low, the furniture mismatched, but the space felt his. No photos of the past stared down from the walls. No reminders of everything he had given and lost, only potential, raw and waiting. Not anger, not hate. The first few days were quiet, even lonely at times, but it was a loneliness he chose. Not one imposed by someone sitting silently across the room, withholding love like a weapon. In the mornings, he made coffee for one and drank it slowly by the window. At night, he read until he fell asleep, the books acting like bridges, spanning the gap between who he used to be and who he was becoming. He reconnected with friends he hadn't seen in years, people he had quietly drifted from during the long erosion of his relationship with Sophie. He went for runs again, signed up for a weekend writing course. Nothing grand, but each decision stitched a small thread of independence into the fabric of his new life. He didn't talk much about the breakup, not at first. When people asked, he simply said, it was time. That was enough. The rest wasn't for explaining. The truth was he hadn't left because he stopped loving Sophie. He had left because he couldn't keep loving someone who refused to meet him halfway. Loving her had become self-erasure, and he wasn't willing to disappear anymore. One afternoon, a week into his new life, Luke visited a quiet park just outside the city. He sat on a bench overlooking a small lake, watching the ripples glimmer under a calm breeze. A woman nearby threw breadcrumbs to a cluster of ducks with her daughter, their laughter light and unburdened. The sound made Luke smile, Not because he longed for it, but because he was finally open to experiencing joy again. Not performance, not placation, just real, simple happiness. Meanwhile, Sophie remained in the apartment, surrounded by the shell of what had once been a shared life. She checked her phone daily, sometimes hourly, waiting for a message that never came. She didn't cry much. Not because she wasn't hurting, but because the grief hadn't fully bloomed yet. It lingered in the corners, subtle but growing, like a storm she thought she could avoid. Her sulking had once drawn Luke back every time. Now it only echoed in a room that no longer housed his forgiveness. Back in his loft, Luke pulled open his laptop and began writing again. Not about Sophie, not yet. He wrote about silence and freedom, about the beauty of starting from scratch and the quiet resilience it takes to walk away when no one expects you to. His fingers moved without hesitation, the words coming faster than they had in years. Not all wounds needed to bleed loudly. Some healed best in quiet places. Luke wasn't searching for closure. He had made peace with the unanswered questions. The most important one had already been resolved. He was free. Not just from Sophie, but from the person he had become in the process of trying to be enough for someone who never tried back. And in that freedom, he had found something unexpected. Himself. Just tired.